Welcome to Victoria Rumble Room, an island show that endeavors to bring you, we think, important stories from the local vantage point, provincially, nationally, around the world. And I'm Robin Adair. Around the corner in Saanich, in his Saanich studio, is my co-host with the most, John Jurisic. And John, so many things to talk about, a busy time.
Exactly. And there was a time when local was local, wasn't it? And to some degree, provincial was provincial. I mean, it sounds so simple. All of those things are now intertwined. So when we start covering things like this big, they're happening in our backyard. And so why not start off with a very recent announcement? I think it's great. Kick things off today by recognizing ex-Premier John Horgan. A huge congratulations to our former Premier and West Shore political veteran. He's been named the Canadian ambassador to Germany. Kind of a surprise to some of us, maybe. A huge honor. However, I'm sure he's gonna do a fabulous job.
Absolutely, John. And, John Horgan is always a very pragmatic guy. And I think that was his big strength, frankly, in BC politics. Now, personally, I can't say I'm that surprised by this announcement that Justin Trudeau actually appointed him. Unlike most of Canada's premiers, Horgan was rarely a thorn in the side of the federal Liberals. Yeah, he got kind of upset about what happened with the expansion of pipelines, but he never really crossed swords with Ottawa, like, for example, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec. And so you have to think, in the middle of all this, the Prime Minister maybe was looking to do a final big thing before he takes his walk in the snow. Is appointing John Horgan indeed going to be one of his last acts before he announced that he's leaving? We'll have to wait and see. But all of that said, congratulations to John Horgan.
Walk in the snow. Wouldn't that be something? Maybe walk in the in the leaves. Maybe in the fall. Okay, whatever. I'm also glad.
Well, his dad was famous for doing the walk in the snow just before he resigned. Just to bring it all back, John. I know you were just an infant when that was happening.
That's right. I'm so glad, however, to see that John, obviously, therefore, his health is good. And that's certainly what we were all thinking was one of the reasons he resigned. I doubt he would have accepted such a role if he wasn't feeling hale and hearty. Fabulous to see this feather in British Columbia's cap. Meantime, our current Premier, David Eby, is drawing attention of a different kind with his new legislation, forcing 90% of the municipalities in BC to expand housing density, including duplexes, laneway homes, and apartment blocks. It's going to just cause a war, not a war in the woods, but a war in the
municipal
hallway.
Offices. All the mayors and councils would be just thinking, well, what am I going to do with my time now?
Exactly. Oh my God. Will this make a major difference, however, to our housing shortage crisis? We'll have to wait and see.
Absolutely, John. And that's not the only thing that's being dealt with right now in terms of provincial responsibility, or federal for that matter. Save Our Streets Committee has been launched off. SOS, they're calling it. And Jeff Bray from the Victoria Downtown Business Association says it's time for all levels of government, municipal, provincial, federal, to stop talking and start putting people in secure facilities to help them with their drug addiction, with their mental illness, for the crime, all this shoplifting, people breaking into homes, breaking into businesses. It's terrible. And Bray says, we have to think about compassion, but compassion doesn't mean leaving people on the streets to die on the streets. He says that the SOS movement is indeed a province-wide movement.
Yes, it originated out of Vancouver, but it's actually a province-wide coalition. So we've got business groups from around the province, citizens groups. So it's not just a Victoria problem or an Nanaimo problem, Vancouver. We're seeing these types of things happen around the province. And so the real focus of this group is to say, look, cities really aren't capable of dealing with this, nor are they responsible for, holding people pending trial or mental health and addictions. But these are the things that are driving some of the issues that we're talking about, including rampant theft, rampant shoplifting. And certainly we're seeing that here in Victoria. And yeah, no individual business wants to stand up and say, geez, we're a target, or that our business is unsafe. And so it falls to groups like us to be able to say on their behalf, we need some significant changes from the provincial government.
And no business wants to step forward and say we imminently may be closing because it's getting too difficult to do business. But you're hearing things like that.
Well, absolutely. What's happening in downtown is, business is generally fairly good. We've recovered very well from COVID. Yes, we don't have provincial government office workers back in large numbers, but overall business is doing okay because we've got lots of people who live downtown, and of course we're still a great tourist destination. But the fatigue from constantly having to deal with this, the constant issue with staff not feeling safe and recruiting and retaining staff, especially in retail, especially younger people, especially women who are working, on a late November night at 5 o'clock, it's dark, they may not feel safe. So we're hearing that businesses are really getting exhausted from this, and when their leases are coming up, they're having a hard look at saying, notwithstanding that business is fairly good, do I want to put up with all this other hassle and put my staff at the front line of some of this activity when there's a sense that it's a level of lawlessness and non-accountability that is really frustrating.
We ran a different clip of Jeff Bray talking about this whole SOS movement, and this was the first ringing of the alarm that this issue is really important, and that compassion isn't about just letting people be out on the street. It's about saving lives from people that are really out of control. And we've had a lot of feedback on this already, John. For example, there was a note that said, "Who is Jeff Bray? And can we please get him to run for mayor next term?" This is the only sane and logical discussion I've heard about this topic in the last year.
Cool comments. We've had hundreds of them. And Kelly, he also wrote us at the Rumble Room, "Enough talking, more doing. Jeff is 100% right. We can place elderly in care homes for their health and long-term care, but now we cannot do the same for the drug adult. It's time for tougher love."
And we'll continue to closely follow this story, John, but now it's time to move to another important theme. Of course, it's something that we're very, very strongly supportive of, and you can see we're wearing our poppies as we salute the men and women who have sacrificed. We remember them during this time of Remembrance Day, which is on the 11th, but really people wear poppies for a couple of weeks around this, and I think it's such a great thing to remember sacrifice and people who have sacrificed for Canadian values. And there is such a thing as Canadian values, and it's important. Now, a good friend of our show, music producer and film editor Chris Ainscough, regularly shoots and produces interviews with World War II veterans for the Juno Beach Society. And we had Commander Peter Chance, who lived out in, or I believe still is living with us, is out in Sydney, and we featured him last year. Well, Chris was able to send us some more of these interviews along with Peter Chance. These are memories of people who served during the last World War.
I look back on it and I think for others following in my footsteps, the kind of examples that I had, that they might be of use to other generations coming forward.
There were many, many people involved in Army, Navy, and the Air Force. And many, many were doing their job, doing it for their country. To have that Canada badge on your shoulder amongst everyone else meant something you couldn't replace.
Speaking about me, I want them to know that I sincerely feel that I was very fortunate to be me in the very fact that I've tried my best to bring about peace and make Canada a better place for all of us and a better place in the world, in the eyes of the world. And I think I did my little share. If we're not around to tell them, how are they going to know? Who's going to tell them?
it's so inspiring to hear from these heroes, especially in this world with so many wars, serious wars going on. It really draws this all home, as it does every year, but somehow this year seems to be a little bit more sensitive and a little bit closer. I understand some of these speakers have now passed away, obviously, while a few are still with us. Their message and memory always lives on.
It does, and it's important to remember. And we watch these terrible conflicts that are going on right now in the Middle East, in Ukraine, and we hope someday they'll find some resolution. And it'd be great to have a semblance of peace in the world. But the wars do continue. And we focused the last couple of weeks on all of the conflict taking place in the Gaza and Israel. Hamas, of course, have been using civilians basically as human shields. And they're getting a lot of positive media for that, I think. And it's a terrible thing. There's like 2 million people living in the Gaza, and they are in the center of this terrible war where the bombs rained into Israel, and now the Israelis are bombing the Gaza, and a lot of people, innocent people, are dying, and that includes women, it includes children, and it's a terrible situation right now. And then we move from that, and people haven't been talking to what's been going on in Ukraine recently. It's still happening. It's still a major war. We're past, I believe it's 300,000 Russian soldiers who have fallen in Ukraine since that conflict began. And, you know, we are always looking to update what's going on in these conflicts. And we thought, well, okay, we'll take a look this week. It's Remembrance Day week. And let's take a look at the battle in Ukraine once again. And we turn to retired Lieutenant Colonel Chris Kilford. Let's zoom him in. And now joining us again in the Victoria Rumble Room, one of our favorite guests on this program, Chris Kilford, who's a retired lieutenant colonel, former artillery officer, and who is currently the president of the Victoria branch. It's the largest branch in Canada of the Canadian International Council. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you. Good to see you, Robin. Good to see you, John. I'm always pleased to be here.
Fabulous.
Well, we've got lots to ask you about. You know, I was reading on the weekend as I was sipping my coffee and reading the news, an article from Don Martin that really caught my attention that said that Ottawa is looking to trim $1 billion from the defense budget. This is at the same time that they are ladling out hundreds of millions of dollars for support for Ukraine. So what do you make of this? Is it true? And if it is true, how much is this going to hurt?
Yeah, I think it is true. I think it's a part of across the government cuts that are going to come, and they're coming to the Defense Department to say, you know, give us back $1 billion. So it is important. It's not new, though, is it? I mean, I was a member of the armed forces for a very long time, even through the decade of darkness in the 1990s when our defense budget was trimmed considerably. And so here we come, it's 2023, and they're now looking for $1 billion to come out of the Defense Department's budget. Now, of course, the biggest issue with this is that not that long ago in Lithuania at the NATO summit, we committed to spending 2% of our GDP on defense. So in many respects, you have to think about what's the message that we're giving to NATO, for example, when it comes to defense spending. How serious are we? So this is very, very important. As to the $1 billion, though, where's it going to come from? Well, I'm not so sure if it's going to have a huge impact per se on the home front, if you like, because we know every single year, for lots of reasons, the department gives back about $1 billion. We also know that the armed forces is short about 10,000 personnel. And if you look at the average salary across the board, you've probably got another $750 million that you're not going to spend this coming year because you don't have anybody to pay. So I don't think at the end of the day it's going to make a huge difference. But the fact remains is that we made a commitment in Vilnius. We have to get serious about defense spending and procurement, and this is a big issue. And so what are the government's plans going to be? Right? That's the question. We know this defense review taking place. The 2017 defense papers, strong, secure, engaged, is outdated now. It needs to be updated in light of events with China and Ukraine. If you go back to that 2017 document, you only see China mentioned twice in the defense document. And it's in glowing terms. It's like, yes, we need to work with them. And Russia's only mentioned once. So now we've got to move on beyond this. And we need to have a new defense policy. And we need to reflect what's happening on the ground today.
Chris, always so great to speak with you, and easily one of the Rumble Room's most popular speakers. Thanks for joining us today. Like a lot of folks, I follow the events in Ukraine closely and the politics of the war in Ukraine closely. And I've been a little discouraged, frankly, naively likely, and ignorant likely, to see the much publicized Ukraine counteroffensive gaining little ground.
Mm-hmm.
I worry that Ukraine doesn't have the manpower, likely the weapons, to keep up this fight for too much longer. That could be a misstatement as well. Mm-hmm. What's your read, please, on the conflict? And do you believe Ukraine has enough horsepower to keep going toe-to-toe with Russia?
Yeah, when it comes to going toe-to-toe, I would say yes, they do have enough weaponry. They have enough people. You could ask the question of the Russians, do you have enough weaponry and ammunition, because they have gone cap in hand to North Korea to get assistance. So they have their issues as well. But what you do have is two significantly well-equipped military forces facing off against one another, doing a jab here, neither side willing to commit totally, because if they do and they fail, they know that is going to be catastrophic, especially for the Ukrainians. If they were to commit on a large scale counteroffensive and it was to fail, they might find themselves in really deep trouble. So everyone is very, very cautious. The problem we have in the West is that we've become conditioned to easy fights. Mm-hmm. And we can go back to the Persian Gulf War in 1991. We can go to Afghanistan in the early days when we got rid of the Taliban very quickly. You can go to Iraq 2003, where we overwhelmed Saddam's forces, and we can go to Libya in 2011 when we took away the Gaddafi regime almost overnight. And so in the West, we've been conditioned to these easy wins against ill-prepared, ill-trained, poorly led military forces. And that's simply not the case that you're finding in Russia. Despite the early missteps that they made, like a good military, they've been able to recover and hold their ground and even launch some limited counteroffensives. So this is the issue for us, conditioned to these easy wins. This is different. This is a real conventional style war along the lines, it runs the spectrum of being like the First World War to then this high-tech war of drones and missiles and so forth. I was looking the other day, how interesting it was. There was an attack in Sevastopol, and it was a Ukrainian attack on the Black Sea headquarters fleet. And they used these cruise missiles, British and French cruise missiles, to destroy the Black Sea headquarters. And it reminded me of the Crimean War. It was the Crimean War, where we had the French and the British and the Ottoman Empire at the time attacking Sevastopol, Balaclava. We haven't progressed very far, have we? We're right back to where we used to be. And the past is still with us. And so coming back to your question, though, John, this is a fight that is now turning into be a bit of a stalemate. I think it's just going to be like this now into next year. And we're going to have to wait for the next round of, shall we say, situations that we can discuss.
I'd like to get into that a little bit. It does strike me that the Russian people seem oblivious to really what's going on. They seem to buy in more than we could possibly imagine what's being said on their TV shows and their talk shows. And they do talk to people on the street occasionally. They're very guarded, but they don't sound like they're ready to bring down this government. So you have to wonder what kind of pressure Vladimir Putin is really under. What's his end game? Is he waiting for there to be a presidential change of command in the United States? Is he waiting for Trump to come back and just stop the war? Is he waiting for the Russians to finally wear down the Ukrainians, or they put up their hands? I mean, what do you think his end game is in this?
Well, in some respects, he reminds him of Hitler in the bunker in 1945. Hitler was also looking at a change of administration in the United States. He was relying on superweapons to come to his rescue. And so it became wishful thinking at the end of the day. And I think in Moscow, there's some of that going on as well. Now, in some respects, they'll be quite happy because it looks like a pro-Russia government may form in Slovakia. He sees pushback in Poland supplying support to Ukraine. I mean, he'd always be on the lookout for any divisions, let's say, within the West. It would make him quite happy. And of course, and who wouldn't when you're in what I would call a desperate situation? We consider Russia to be a superpower, let's say, for lack of a better term, because it has nuclear weapons, and on the surface it appears quite powerful. But I think it was quite telling that Russia had to go cap in hand to North Korea and previously to Iran. It's fine for Ukraine to come cap in hand to the West because, it's a poorish country. It didn't have much in the way of resources, and it got attacked. And so sure enough, it comes to us for help. But then you never expected to see the Russians having to go to North Korea to literally beg for ammunition. So I think for Putin, it is desperate. He's looking for any fissures, especially in Washington, and possibly wishfully thinking that his generals on the front lines can achieve a breakthrough. And I just don't think it's going to happen. And day by day, cut by cut, life in Russia gets more and more difficult. The Russian people, for example, they see the body bags coming back. They're not blind to this. It's just a case of they live in a police state, so they're not able to take action to go to the streets. It's so incredibly dangerous. What will happen down the road? I mean, I would think there's a lot of wishful thinking in the West as well. When we look at Moscow, we're also hoping that something happens to Putin, that something does happen within the country. So at the moment, we have a major conflict in Europe, both sides stuck in the mud, literally, while everybody around is wishfully thinking that something will break on either side that will work in their favor.
All right, Chris, let's bring this war in Ukraine back to the battle in Canada, the political battle. Our federal government was recently embarrassed when President Zelensky was visiting Parliament and the speaker introduced a 98-year-old Ukrainian veteran. Everyone's clapping. Everyone's very righteous at that moment. The guy turned out to be a veteran of the German SS. Come on. The Russians have long accused, of course, this was perfect fitting into this narrative. The Russians have long accused the Ukraine of being Nazis. Do you think this incident was harmful in the big picture, or really just a short-term embarrassment for our prime minister?
I think it's all of that. There's that initial short-term embarrassment where the speaker has to resign. The opposition, of course, is all over it with the government. The government's obviously embarrassed. There are apologies being made. So in the short term, inside the country, it is an issue. In fact, it almost put the whole India thing on the back burner, but our relations with India, but now I see that's flaring up. So there'll always be an issue around the corner that will take our immediate attention away from what happened in Parliament. However, having said that, at the international level, it has created issues, and people do look and think, how could this have happened? Now, we're not the first country in the world to end up in some sort of embarrassing situation with a politician on the stage with what turns out to be a terrorist. We're not the first, and we won't be the last. But in the case of this, the Russians, obviously, this is like propaganda gold to have in their hands, and they will make, as they are, full effective use of it. So we handed something to them on a platter, and so we suffer the consequences of that. It's a moment to think about. It's caused us to look at our own history, and there'll be more to follow on this. But so it's caused some immediate damage, some long-term damage. We'll be living with it for a while. At some point, something else will come up, and our attention will move on. But it was completely unnecessary. It's a sad situation that this happened, the Russians would have. Well, they obviously love what happened.
I just want to get back very quickly to a question about diplomacy, because you see the Russians make noises about diplomacy. I know they don't seem very sincere about it, but there's a lot of people out there would love to see ultimately some sort of a settlement. And what has been mentioned several times is very rarely is there an outright punch out where one side is vanquished and the other side marches in, like it happened in the Second World War in Berlin, obviously, but much more often there is a signed settlement at some point. Do you think that's even a possibility? Do you think there is a scenario where that could happen? What would it take? Would it take the Ukrainians really to maybe take back Crimea and then the Russians would say that's enough? Or are the Russians in such a lockstep on this thing, there's no way that they can sue for peace unless they win?
Every analyst you speak to, every commentator has, if asked this question, has a solution, well, it should be like this, or it's such a difficult question to answer, because I can sit here as a neutral and say, well, it could be negotiated and everybody will be happy. But if you sit with Ukrainians or Russians, you would find that they would not agree with you if you suggested that Ukraine give up Crimea in order to gain membership into the European Union or NATO down the road. I mean, many Ukrainians I speak to are appalled at the idea that they would somehow give up Crimea. The way this conflict is going, though, I would say, is that both sides at some point will start to say this is it's exhausting. We just can't go on like this, and we need to come to some interim arrangement and stop the fighting, and there'll be moves to have some sort of a peace conference and that sort of thing. The issue with that, though, is we have seen this time and time again in the region. The most apropos example is with Azerbaijan and Armenia, that started fighting when the Soviet Union collapsed. And recently you saw Azerbaijan take back all of the territory they lost in the early 1990s. There's ethnic cleansing. The Armenian population has left. Well, that was a conflict that also became, in many respects, frozen for years as there were negotiations. And then finally one side figured that they had the upper hand and now was the time to strike. And so you can take that over to the Ukrainian-Russian situation and say, both sides are exhausted. They decide to sit down. They stop fighting for the moment. But then in 10 years, it all flares up again. So there's no easy resolution to this conflict. It may come to a stop in a year or two because both sides have had enough. But if it's not resolved in some fashion, it will come back again. It will flare up again, and we'll be back talking about it again in 10 years, if the Rumble Room is around, which I'm sure it will be.
Oh, we're not quitting until one of us dies. And then maybe...
Okay. You heard it here. You heard it here first. Okay. So once again, we're wearing the poppies, but we're not forgetting about what's going on around the world, and we're trying to keep you up to date as much as we possibly can. And it's important not to glorify what's going on. War is a terrible thing. I believe it was Robert E. Lee, the famous Confederate general, right after the Battle of Fredericksburg, which was a Southern victory. And he said, "It's well that war is so terrible, otherwise we should grow too fond of it." And those were wise words, and we should all keep them in mind. And with that, John, I think it's just about time to wrap the show.
Fascinating show, Robin. Very somber show. Hard to be jovial and kidding around when in this situation all over the place. We certainly want to give a big shout out, a huge shout out to everyone who's serving or who has served Canada in the military and in the armed forces. For that matter, we equally honor our police, our firefighters, our healthcare workers, all of those people on the front line in our communities, all of those folks who try to make our lives safer. We're very glad to deliver this kind of information and hope that you'll regularly check out the Rumble Room on all of our various sites. They include Facebook, of course, Twitter and X, YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, and Facebook news groups. For now, I'm wearing a poppy and remembering as best I can those who've sacrificed to make Canada such a great country. I'm John Jurisic.
And John, besides remembering those who have bravely fallen for our country, I just want to take a moment to remember someone else, an old friend, John Bate, who just passed away in the last few weeks. And John was the Victoria Director of Parks and Recreation and the longtime assistant manager of the old Memorial Arena. He was a prince of a man. And he and his wife, Marilyn, used to be part of the neighborhood off of Tattersall and Saanich, where they had the famous Christmas street, Candy Cane Lane. And I remember once taking our son, Brian. We went with our son, Brian, to show him all the lights. He was only 2. And we drove up to see the lights and were invited in to John and Marilyn's home for a hot cocoa. And their place was jam-packed with Christmas decorations. Brian loved it. Anyway, John retired the same week, incidentally, that I left Czech TV back in 1997. And, I was covering his retirement as one of my very last stories working in television. And so deepest condolences go to Marilyn and his family. John was 87. He met so many people, had so many friends, and it's always sad to see a good one go. On that note, I'm Robin Adair, and rumble on.